With introversion and extraversion, to speak of one is to speak of the other. Or, I could say they're two sides of the same coin. That's due to their nature as a pair of opposites. What's true for psychological introversion will be false for psychological extraversion, and vice versa, at least generally speaking. In fact, Jung identifies them as the two main opposite types. He also notes he's not the first to make the distinction. So, what does it mean for them to be opposite types? It's useful here to differentiate between introversion and extraversion as attitudes and as types. Jung defines attitude as a readiness of the psyche to act or react in a certain way. So, introversion and extraversion as attitudes are opposed ways of reacting to something. It's worth noting, Jung's use of the word attitude doesn't just refer to the way we think about something, which is closer to how we typically use the word. Jung defines type this way: when an attitude is habitual, thus setting a definite stamp on the character of an individual, I speak of a psychological type. Put simply, that just means that a psychological type is an attitude that has become habitual. When extraversion is habitual, we speak of the extraverted type. When introversion is habitual, we speak of an introverted type. I'm emphasizing this distinction between type and attitude because of the way our conventional use of the terms introvert and extrovert overlook it. We usually view introversion and extraversion as binary categories. Either a person is introverted or they're extroverted. From the perspective of Jungian psychology, there's no such thing as a pure introvert or extrovert. There's just introverted types and extroverted types, people who are habitually one or the other. As Jung has famously said, there is no such thing as a pure introvert or extrovert. Such a person would be in the lunatic asylum. In his book, Psychological Types, Jung writes, "No man is simply introverted or simply extroverted, but has both attitudes potentially in him. Although he has developed only one of them as a function of adaptation, we shall immediately conjecture that with the introvert, extraversion lies dormant and underdeveloped somewhere in the background, and that introversion leads a similar, shadowy existence in the extrovert. This makes an important point about how we ought to view our own introversion or extraversion. If you've watched my video on individuation, you'll know that identification with one's psychological function will lead to alienation of one's polar, underdeveloped psychological function. To put it another way, identifying with introversion, or labeling oneself as an introvert, will inhibit one's innate capacity for extraversion, while also inhibiting one's ability to individuate. It's often the case that people take finding their personality type, or Myers-Briggs result, as an endpoint, that they've learnt something about their self that isn't changing, and just has to be lived with. Instead, Jung would urge us to see finding one's personality type as a starting point for bringing the wholeness of one's personality to greater consciousness. As Jung said in a 1957 interview, and I'm abridging here, with all these classifications, they are only points for orientation. Rather than conforming to our habitual psychic attitude, we should instead seek to reflect on what's habitual and underdeveloped in our psyche. The discovery of one's psychological type is only useful if it facilitates deepening self-understanding and progressing individuation. Treating personality type as an absolute, binding fact just inhibits self-understanding and individuation by making us blind to what's underdeveloped in us. With that out of the way, it's time to look at how Jung defines introversion and extraversion. Extraversion is an outward turning of libido, which just means psychic energy. I use this concept to denote a manifest relation of subject to object, a positive movement of subjective interest towards the object. Everyone in the extroverted state thinks, feels, and acts in relation to the object. Extraversion is a transfer of interest from subject to object. Introversion means an inward turning of libido, in the sense of a negative relation of subject to object. Interest does not move towards the object, but withdraws from it into the subject. Everyone whose attitude is introverted thinks, feels, and acts in a way that clearly demonstrates that the subject is the prime motivating factor and that the object is of secondary importance. Again here, there's a striking difference between our conventional use of these terms and Jung's use of the terms. Bear in mind, Jung originally coined the words introvert and extrovert in 1921 in his book Psychological Type, which I recommend reading if you're interested in learning more. It's due to the work of Hans Eysenck that the terms have come to focus on social outgoingness. For Jung, introversion and extraversion aren't just about our attitude towards other people, it's about our attitude to the world at large, to our environment, and to any or all objects. As Jung says regarding extroverts, his interest and attention are directed to objective happenings, particularly those in his immediate environment. Not only people, but things seize and rivet his attention. To put Jung's definitions more simply, an introvert is more interested and stimulated by their internal subjective world, and an extrovert is more interested and stimulated by the objective external world. For the introvert, the internal world is prioritized in working out how to think, speak, and act, and for the extrovert, the external world is the priority. Jung also connects introversion and extraversion with energy. It is sufficient to note that the peculiar nature of the extrovert constantly urges him to expend and propagate himself in every way, while the tendency of the introvert is to defend himself against all demands from outside, to conserve his energy by withdrawing it from objects. Jung's understanding of introversion and extraversion turn out to be these extremely broad, foundational psychological attitudes that relate subject and object in polarized ways. Given this broadness, it's obvious that both attitudes are deeply necessary, and also that there's a need to go between them. Just in one day, it seems there's going to be lots of moments where I'm withdrawing my energy and focusing on my internal world, for example, when writing this script, and moments where I really need to focus on the external world, for example, if I'm cooking. What can happen is we cling so much to one attitude that it trips us up, and that's because we've failed to acknowledge the polar attitude. For example, we can get so wrapped up in objective external happenings, like work projects or social functions, or things like the news and politics, that it comes at the expense of us noticing how these things affect our psychic reality, our subjective world. At the same time, we can get so wrapped up in our hopes, fantasies, and dream goals that we fail to recognize whether they're disconnected from reality. From personal experience, I find doing something hands-on and practical or extroverted to be really helpful if I've gotten too wrapped up in my internal introverted world. Jung's work on introversion and extraversion pushes us to ask ourselves, which attitude has become habitual in me? Where in life does that habitual attitude need compensation from the polar attitude? And perhaps most importantly, am I harboring negative assumptions and beliefs about a particular attitude that keep me from accessing it? If you enjoyed this video and would like me to take more walks through Jung's work, a like or comment is much appreciated.